Mrs. Flood, the seemingly innocent, sweet, and ordinary neighbour to the new companion Ruby Sunday, holds a dark secret about her hidden identity. Someone with far more importance and danger than anyone could have ever first possibly imagined. There are vast possibilities to who exactly she could be, but all lead to a very cold, dark outcome for the Doctor, and something even worse for Ruby. Ruby's clock could already be counting down, and these are the bleak reasons why. Starting with the chilling facts, we know Mrs. Flood is a character hiding in the shadows, awaiting to be revealed. Russell T Davies was very close-lipped with any clues.
Mrs. Flood is a mysterious character. You will eventually find out more about her. She's a slow burn. Who is Mrs. Flood? Come back and find out.
But the actress Anita Dobson paints a more monstrous picture. The scene being filmed, which we got to see behind the scenes, is very much darker in tone than the one we saw on screen.
Never seen a TARDIS before. Never seen a TARDIS before.
Then, when interviewed, she seems to give the suggestions, yes, today she seems like a friendly neighbour, but in the future it will be something very different.
Now you are playing a fascinating, recurring character that we don't know much about. Basically, what I want to say, Anita, is what can you tell me? Because I need to know.
Well, we're sort of finding out about her as we go along.
Yeah.
So today what you've seen is friendly neighbour.
Yeah.
What the future may be, no one knows. Russell is writing it as we speak.
So friendly neighbour, you can cope with that. You don't have to think too hard for that, but you might end up being like an evil genius or something. Oh, he's not giving anything.
I might not.
And the opposite of friendly is hostile. In the classic era, one of the most hostile female characters in Doctor Who was the Rani. We know he's brought back classic villains last seen all the way back in the 60s, and from comic strips first appearing in the 80s, so it wouldn't be too hard to believe. An amoral scientist would give Russell a lot to play with, and a battle between her, the eventual return of the Master, and the Doctor would certainly make for a gruesome finale. Looking at it another way, what is interesting is at the beginning it seems like Mrs. Flood herself doesn't show any signs of being out of the ordinary till a very specific scene, and that is when the TARDIS dematerialises and she is hit with a sudden realisation. Has she just realised this is no ordinary police box? Instead, the police box her parents used to tell her about when she was young. The police box her mum used to travel in. The police box her mum's Raggedy Man first appeared from. Is Mrs. Flood Amy Pond's child? Strangely enough, the more you dig deeper into this conspiracy theory, the more it makes sense. Starting with the most obvious link is the name, Flood. Now some people say this is too far stretched, but people were saying the same when they made the link between pond and river before the reveal, and possibly the link between bodies of water and Amy Pond's family is not yet over. Just as the link between the Doctor and Donna was not yet over, even though the storyline was thought to have finished over a decade ago like this. Amy Pond and Rory Williams were transported back in time by a survivor weeping angel, a loss so tragic to the Doctor he stayed in practically solitary confinement for many hundreds of years above Earth. Amy and Rory lived out their natural lives in 1938 onwards and died of old age. Russell T Davies has been heavily influenced upon the watch-alongs and content put out there during 2020. It was here where the idea for David and Catherine's return started up, and where he used it to canonically mark the death of Sarah Jane Smith, which he confirmed to have happened in the Whoniverse in the Giggle. But perhaps he took influence from another piece of content put out there, Rory's video diary. We know, thanks to this footage, Amy and Rory were expecting a child and getting ready for its birth in 1946, the year this footage was created. If the child was born in 1946, then by this year, 2024, the child would be grown up to be 78 years old, just a few years older than the actress Anita Dobson. This is no coincidence indeed. Rory addresses the video to Anthony, which is a boy's name, but if the baby wasn't born yet, then it would have been almost impossible to find out the sex, as ultrasounds were not around till the mid-50s. Also, with them having had prolonged exposure to the time vortex, who's to say the baby hasn't got Time Lord DNA like Riversong and regenerated since? Could this mean Mrs. Flood is also a Time Lord, or even if it's not their second baby, could it be Riversong herself? Maybe she managed to leave the library, but at a cost. Also, another coincidence between the actress and their child is the name. Anthony's female version of the name is Antonia, very similar to Anita. Is this another very subtle hint towards this possibility too? An originally unintended coincidence Russell noticed and exploited as well. But why has their child turned evil? Maybe out of spite the Doctor had abandoned them and since replaced Amy and Rory several times, with all the facts of why clouded by the hurt that she suffered from their loss. Further adding to the plausibility of this creepy theory is that Millie Gibson is fond of Amy Pond, with Amy being the companion she grew up with. Millie even got in touch with Karen Gillan for advice on the role. Is it possible Millie put in a request of Russell to star with Karen Gillan and for Ruby and Amy to meet, and this is how it would be made possible? We know Karen Gillan is keen to return, as is Jodie Whittaker, which leads us to the next, shockingly coincidental theory. Jodie Whittaker, the 13th Doctor, has since her departure been very vocal in voicing her desire to return, having actually said to Russell she knows it will have to be in a few years' time, but she does want to return. We also know Russell does like both Jodie Whittaker and the 13th Doctor, having been keen to state how brilliant her Doctor is, how he adores Jodie and not retconning her era. We know from Russell himself Mrs. Flood will be a slow burner, so we will find out who she is in a few years' time. Sound familiar? Could Mrs. Flood be an older version of the 13th Doctor? We now know it's possible. Keeping that in mind, another possibility is Mrs. Flood is Ruby's birth mother. It could explain how she remembers very clearly it's Ruby's birthday, and why she lives so close to Ruby to keep an eye on her. Now looking at the mysterious mother of Ruby, she's a hooded figure in boots with her clothes not just quite reaching. Sound familiar again? Not only do both Ruby's mum and the 13th Doctor share similar features such as the hands and mouth, but we know no matter what the 13th Doctor wore, she always kept a similar style, and it looked like she hasn't changed it. Bizarrely enough, could it be the startling possibility that Mrs. Flood is Ruby's mum and the 13th Doctor? Stranger things have happened in Doctor Who. But the conspiracy doesn't stop there with the Doctor. We know Russell has tried to keep the flames alight on the Timeless Child and Flux storylines, with it playing a fairly huge part in the 60th Swirl Blue Yonder and being interlinked with the Foundling storyline in the latest Christmas special, but there is a dark reason for that. Could the Doctor have found the Fobwatch in the TARDIS, opened the Fobwatch containing all her lost memories of being the Timeless Child, entered the house, and somewhere along the lines had her memories harshly wiped again, which filled her with evil, either by being overwhelmed by it all or by some cruel tampering done by Tecteun or Swarm and Azure? Perhaps the Doctor returned to Earth and lived out her life with her identity being hidden, even from her, till the TARDIS suddenly dematerializes in front of her. The more you think about it, the more it makes sense. Just as for John Smith with the Fobwatch, the TARDIS had a perception filter around it, making Mrs. Flood think it's an ordinary police box till it dematerializes. The moment it does, the penny drops, and just like with the Fugitive Doctor, the tech was the activation. Seeing the TARDIS dematerialize was Mrs. Flood's activation. It would explain why up until this moment Mrs. Flood acts ordinary, and onwards from here, mysterious. We know Russell has toyed with this idea before. When Martha Jones could not find the Fobwatch, she brought the Doctor the sonic screwdriver to reawaken his memories, showing the idea has been there all along, planted by Russell T Davies, all the way back in 2007. Is he finally now showing us this can happen and did just happen? Even if Mrs. Flood isn't Ruby's mum, that doesn't mean she's not related to her. Horrifyingly enough, perhaps they share the same DNA, as in identically. Could she be a future version of Ruby? How or why she is will remain a complete mystery till the end of Ruby's adventures on the TARDIS, but it would explain why Mrs. Flood has seen a TARDIS before and know what one is called, as well as knowing why to wish Ruby good luck. Perhaps this has had to happen. Perhaps for Ruby's adventures to happen in the first place, her future self had to convince the Doctor to stay long enough for her younger self to enter the TARDIS. After all, he was contemplating leaving, saying maybe he's the bad luck. Perhaps there were scenes in between this and her saying, "Will you take care?" which we haven't been shown yet, which gives us more answers. After all, why, if the Doctor thought he was the bad luck, would he have stayed long enough to take her on board, unless he was convinced otherwise by Mrs. Flood? There is, of course, the very probable likelihood Mrs. Flood is someone completely new, but that doesn't make it any less terrifying. After all, better the devil you know. Could she perhaps be a more mature version of Helena Bonham Carter's character, as we know she'll be starring in the show in one of the future seasons? We know Helena Bonham Carter has played villains before, so if they are linked, it could provide us with more clues to who Mrs. Flood's cruel character is. But if she is a new character, this is extremely concerning, as we know Doctor Who is currently introducing and reintroducing more godlike villains, and if Mrs. Flood is, then it could mean serious danger for the Doctor and Ruby. Is she part of the Toymaker's legions, or the one that Toymaker dared not face, maybe even the boss? Whichever, Mrs. Flood could of course be toying with the Doctor, hiding in plain sight just as Missy did, and in disguise just like the Master likes to do. A heavy sign towards the return of the Doctor's old friend, now turned harrowing enemy. We know it'll be happening at some stage in this new era. Could Russell be going for an older female version of the Master, not done before? Other possible characters include Susan turned vengeful by the fact the Doctor never returned for her, the Doctor's birth mother angry she never took the chance to travel to her universe, an older version of Clara, a future relative of Captain Adelaide Brooke from the Bowie base who travelled back in time to get revenge for the Doctor's interference, hiding behind the name of the monsters they faced, someone the Doctor has actually met once before and has unfinished business with, someone who knows of the Doctor and is after something, or someone completely unexpected. One thing that is apparent is no matter what possibility you follow, each are corrupt and twisted, and will most likely lead to Mrs. Flood being villainous, meaning a painful ending for at least one of our time-travelling duo. What is most unsettling is we know Mrs. Flood will continue to be lurking around in the background for quite a while, ready to reveal herself, and ultimately, her evil plan. All the whilst the Doctor is completely oblivious to the awful danger about to come his way. Whatever way you look at it, it's going to be shocking, and most of all, it's going to knock the Doctor and the entire Whoniverse off course. She's circling in on the Doctor and Ruby, and is about to pounce.